China's middle class has overtaken the United States to become the largest in the world. However, many of them suffer from an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. What are they afraid of? Is anxiety just a middle-class problem? And how does a changing society contribute or help alleviate people's level of anxiety? To explore these issues and more today, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Shan Bin from Tsinghua University and Professor David Moser from Yanjing Academy at Peking University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. Obviously, we are in the new era with Xi Jinping thoughts being the hallmark to characterize the new official ideology one way or another. However, when we look at the popular sentiments, it seems in each and every era since the founding of PRC in 1949, we had a hallmark vintage to characterize popular sentiments. For example, in the 1950s, everybody had the zealotry to achieve communism overnight, right? It's the radical official ideology of communism under the heavy influence of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Today, it's the second decade of the 21st century. If you are asked politely to present a keyword to characterize the popular sentiments, what would be your most viable option on the table?
Obviously, I think the choice of the anxiety would be the right word. But I think anxiety might not be a negative word, because anxiety usually means transformation, urge for change. So in this sense, I think this is also a precise reflection of this age, because even in the 19 Party Congress report, we said the basic contradiction of our society has been changed to people's wish for better life and the incomplete development of our current society. So I mean, even official ideology would recognize this kind of anxiety is rational.
Well, come on, this sounds ridiculous. Anxiety is rational. What do you think of the contradiction?
Well, I agree actually that fundamental contradiction actually reflects, I think, a global problem, not just China's problem, which is that we've seen many developing countries, and China is arguably a developed country, or at least on the borderline between a developing and a developed country.
You mean this has reached the proportion of what do you call it? Endemic or epidemic?
Epidemic.
Epidemic. Are you suggesting that we have reached the proportion of epidemic globally?
Yeah, I think we see it in Brexit, we see it in the phenomenon of Trump, and we see it in the phenomenon of this socialism in a new era, where they're realizing now that there have been a lot of gains in this neoliberal order, but that they've been uneven, and that economic inequality has worsened, and that the people that are being pulled out of poverty are just getting richer and richer, and the people that are still mired in poverty are staying that way. And this is a complicated phenomenon, but it has to do with the fact that wealth attracts wealth. If you have money, it's easier to keep and make money. The success of Thomas Piketty's book Capital a few years ago was testament to that. I think China, India, the United States, countries at different stages of development are feeling the same kind of anxiety.
Not only Piketty, but the new Pope in Vatican, they were both very critical of capitalism of Wall Street, pointing to the income discrepancy around the world. In less than 40 years, the Chinese feel that they have become the middle class with the deepening of the pockets. Do you think they are feeling uncomfortable with the rapid change of their lifestyle?
I think this is a very common psychology for Chinese people and China as a nation, because I always said China is a sort of a country of duality. We're both the developed and the developing country. In some sector of life, some sector of society and region, we're already a developed country. But I think the majority of this sector of society was still in the developing country state. So this kind of anxiety, I reflect the China status quo as its kind of duality. And on the other hand, I think, as David said, globally, I think we also have the collapse of the Western Enlightenment modernity. I think especially after 2016, we have this post-West, post-order, and post-truth era. So I think that both domestic and international contexts actually increase this kind of sentiment of anxiety.
Do you agree that we are caught unprepared and off guard by the rapid rise in our living standards and lifestyle? Are we getting closer to the American way of life, or are we being alienated?
You know, I think the problem is even the American way of life, excuse me, is dying out or is undergoing transformation. I'm a good example of that. I'm a baby boomer, which means I was born in the 1950s. My father could raise a family of 3 kids, send us all to school, and have a vacation, a pension, with no anxiety, because it was a different kind of economy. Now I don't know of anyone who could raise a family that way without feeling a certain amount of uncertainty and anxiety. China is facing similar kinds of problems because with the collapse of the state-owned enterprises, the Danwei system, the sort of cradle-to-grave guarantees are gone. People are thrown into the market to look for jobs, and now they are the older generation is living longer. It was the one-child policy that created this shrinking sort of workforce, but now we have a 2-child policy. So there's this uncertainty and anxiety among a middle class that even though they have money now and they can make more money, they've got more mouths to feed than their parents and their grandparents, and they've got more children to feed, and education, cars, houses are getting more expensive. So you would think it would be a time of happiness and optimism. But it's a feeling of terror because they're looking ahead and they're saying, how am I going to support this lifestyle? And there's no guarantee that in this market that they'll have job security. So this is the same in my father's era. It's the same with other countries throughout the world, even in Europe, stable Europe that for a long time, you know, had its sort of democratic socialist countries where the welfare state was working very well, and even in Great Britain where you had you know, socialized medicine to some extent. It's all breaking down. All the rules are being broken. People are starting to realize that the rules have changed, and unless we do something, we're going to be the victims of all
And the
this.
rise of the social media, the internet, also threaten to disrupt our traditional way of thinking and traditional lifestyle. Having said this, let's discuss this issue with a sense of history. You, David did a good job by talking about it from the global perspective. What about a sense of history? For example, David, when you first came to China, what was the basic and pervasive sense about the Chinese? Were they very comfortable and complacent about the basic use of bicycles? China was called the kingdom of bicycles. Today we are a nation on the wheels, like the United States 40 or 50 years ago. What was the basic feeling? We were old enough to recall something that we all went through in the 1960s and 70s, right?
I just remember vividly that China was a much more equal society back then, but it was also a very poor society. Per capita GDP was very low, about sort of
Are you alluding
Portugal.
to the word of egalitarianism? That is a very bad
economic.
word.
Well,
Economically, yeah.
It was economically very much more equal, but people were optimistic because there was a reform and opening up. People were getting rich. There was the Baofahu, you know, that Deng Xiaoping was saying, to get rich is glorious. Go ahead and get rich. Some people will get rich first. So people were optimistic that at least their children would do better than they would, and that they're doing better than their parents. So there was some uncertainty, but it was mostly hopeful uncertainty. Nobody knew exactly how far this could go, but there was a feeling that we were moving ahead. And it was a very easy, it was a very, what we say, low-hanging fruit. Because there was so much poverty, the pockets of areas where you could actually create a huge difference by using market forces and this new economy were enormous. And that's why in the last 30 years, China has brought something around the order of 700 million people out of poverty because that reform and opening up was this motor of driving the economy.
Yes, indeed, poverty alleviation presented a silver lining in the darkest clouds 2 or 3 decades ago. Are young people losing their hope today for a bright future, since they are more or less part of the middle class, meaning the decency of life is basically guaranteed by a social security program and by a steady job for white-collar workers, young ones in the urban areas, such as first and second-tier cities? Are they losing their hopes today with rapid competition, tough competition, and the changes that we have spoken of?
Not so much for Chinese young people, in my view, because I think this generation, called millennium generation in China, is so-called little pink, or they are more nationalistic, they feel more pride in the country. And also, I think they have more wish list than their parents' generation. On the other hand, I think they have more materialistic affluence in their mind. So, especially, I think the recent years, China provides a lot of chances for the internet plus economy. So that's why I think young people now in China usually have a more optimistic attitude toward the country and toward the world than their peers in
because
other countries.
They have the chance of running a startup company in the IT industry with a lot of venture capitals being poured into this domain. Look at the alleged advent of IT era in the next decade or beyond. What do you think of the impact of digital technology upon the future of the young people?
Well, obviously, it's created a lot of new products, new economies, bike sharing and things that spring up very fast. But that's another kind of, that just gives rise to another kind of anxiety. If this rate of change is so quick, people have trouble adapting. There can be a sort of like the internet boom of the late 1990s that President Clinton oversaw in the United States only lasted so long. There's a point at which there's a cutoff. And nowadays those sort of booms are happening quicker and quicker, and the turnover rate is faster. So it creates pockets of wealth, but it doesn't create stability and predictability, which is what people need in order to plan for the future. It creates opportunities, but not everyone can take advantage of the opportunities.
So compared to what happened in 1950s or even 1980s, both China and the world now lie in a sort of transformative turning point. So this is why this sense of anxiety was even, I think, augmented throughout the whole world and also in China. But more importantly, I think, just as you mentioned, social media is a very special media platform to aggregate this kind of emotional sharing. So this also in many ways to kind of increase this kind of emotional anxiety to be spread over very quick period of time, and like I would call it virus communication of this emotion.
You know, the internet and social media was supposed to bring people together and then enable them to unite and have a common understanding of the world and share. And in fact, it's done the opposite. It's created a world in which people can break off in little isolated communities, cyber communities with their own discourse and their own way of talking. And the worst example being the United States.
We are talking about lifestyle and popular feeling. However, ideologically and spiritually, quite what runs deep. Despite the absolute primacy and dominance of the official ideology, don't you think the broad spectrum of public opinions is seriously divided? If you look at the WeChat groups, those guys, the liberals, the outspoken liberals, they disagree with some of the official policy options. So what do you think of the possibility of building consensus in terms of improving the governance to develop a kind of more leniency and tolerance for differences? We are able to live with differences. I mean, that's a hallmark of a civil society.
But I think the best solution, like Confucius said, with unity under difference. But the point is that now difference that takes all, I mean, all standpoint of our ideological sphere. For example, that we have the so-called echo chamber and also information cocoon. Or we call it the filter bubble, actually prevailed in social media. In that way, we actually increase the polarization of society, not only in China, but also in the United States. So in this way, we do not have a consensus in ideological building. So that's why the whole society was even, I think this anxiety even being increased in many ways.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Shen Bin from Tsinghua University and David Moser from Yanqing. We are discussing why anxiety pervades all segments of the population, the sizable population of 1.4 billion almost in China in the new era. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, gentlemen. What do you think should be the solution or a remedy for the popular feeling of anxiety?
Obviously, President Xi has a very famous notion of the community of shared future. I think also the One Belt One Road initiative was a kind of new way that we...
But that's an issue of nation making. However, individually, let's look at the human feelings. Is it more about the faith, index of happiness? All these things need to have a redefinition.
Yeah, I think that that China, and specifically Xi Jinping, do have the right idea. They've isolated the part of the problem, which is that you can have a growing economy, but it has to be shared. There has to be a sense of shared sacrifice and shared values. And right now, this threats a sort of schism where you begin to pit the economic lower class against the elite rich, and which is the so-called Gini coefficient, if you know what that is, the measure of inequality of a society in both China and the United States is very dangerously high. The economic inequality is very high. And so Xi Jinping has the right idea. You want to create a moderately prosperous society, which we used to call the middle class, sort of, in the United States. And here in China, there's a technical term, 小康, the 小康社会, right? The 小康.
The well-to-do society.
Well-to-do society. Yeah. They've got to create that, a rich middle class that feels secure and that feels that it's not, existentially threatened.
But I'm afraid a renowned professor from Harvard, whose name you know, I'm afraid, Samuel Huntington, disagrees with you, seriously. He says, when people are poor, the society is basically very stable. However, he said famously, modernity is stable, but modernization is the opposite. When you look at the growth of the middle class, either in size or in quality, in terms of the quality of their life, they demand the rule of law, they demand social justice rather than the material affluence. So when people get rich or with the rise of their living standards, do you think it's easier or the opposite for the society to exercise good governance, to bring to build a more cohesiveness and to build consensus? What do you think of, the ability to modernize the governance and to build consensus?
This is also what I think the Party Congress has already pointed out, that the level of governance, no matter in China or in the globe, has kind of did not actually match up with the growing need of people's wish, as you said, materialistically or spiritual need. But on the other hand, I think also from many the public opinion event in this year, we can see a kind of gap between the official and the public in communicating the common ground.
For example, the massive evictions of migrants in Daxing County, Beijing. I mean, that caused an uproar in the social media. Strong resentment against the pretty bad manners of those law enforcement personnel. What do you think of the perception gap between the government and ultimate folks on the media?
That caused quite a furor in social media and in the foreign press.
Fury and fire.
Fury and fire. And I think one of the reasons for that is, people can sort of see who are the victims of this massive modernization and who are the sort of benefiter, the people who benefit. And these are people who are struggling very hard to raise their standard of living, to survive, to give their children a better life. And then in the interest of modernization, we're trying to make our city look beautiful, and your buildings are ugly, so we're going to kick you out of the city. That there's a basic unfairness. People, even the middle class, or even many enlightened upper class, can look at that and see the unfairness. It's just unfair on the face of it. And so that's the party's problem. That's the U.S.'s problem. That's why there's been a popular or backlash against people like Hillary Clinton in the last election, these elites, these neoliberals, they've never solved our problem, they've never had our interest at heart. And it's a worldwide phenomenon. They're tired of this, and they want a system that works for them.
Look, eventually, by the end of the day, we'll find ourselves repeating much the same question as to consensus building or the issue of a silent majority. Look at the Me Too campaign. People who represent this campaign were elected the People of the Year by the Time magazine. In China, silent majority forms basically the mainstream spectrum of whatever decades, whatever era, or whatever dynasties for centuries. Today, however, what do you think of the similarity, be it the United States or the Chinese, that people may go to extreme? Or do you think in China we have the 中庸之道, less is more, good means?
The way of the middle, the way of the middle ground.
Exactly. In the United States, in Europe, the rise of populism means the extremes of public opinions. In China, under the heavy influence of traditional culture, do you think we would end up making compromise all the time as we did in the past? Or we're going to get closer to the Western societies? I mean, public opinions are likely to be divided seriously, radically, and we're going to have more of the extremism. Some of them would be transformed or morph into terrorism.
Yeah, so this is back to our earlier argument that we probably need a more efficient and also more sympathetic governance, because that actually requires the government actually can balance all the need from different sectors of life and society, and also try to incorporate different kind of urges and voices into their final decision making. So this is actually demand of sort of like modernized or even more efficient governance, the way of governance, and particularly media will play a very important role in this field. As I said before, that the recent event we just have discussed, communication has become a big problem because the government and public do not have a very efficient and also very I believe ready-made channel for communication. So this is what we
social and
change.
political governance is one thing. The index of happiness for the individuals is quite another. Look at the United States, David. You have the First Amendment and Second Amendment to check and balance in the Parliament with the opposition waiting in the wing politically. Every 4 years you can have a new party, a new face in the White House. Do you think these basic institutions guarantee the basic stability of the society? You're not going to have a coup attempt or a revolution in the sense of, say, the Arab Revolution or whatever. In the United States, no one would care you're going to have a radical, violent regime change. Things are just institutionalized.
It's true that our legitimacy is based more on the Constitution, as you said, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and not the actual performance of the government. That's why lately with polarized left-right politics, we've had this pattern of they elect the left-leaning people for a while until they get tired of them and they don't believe in them anymore, kick them out, and then they go to the opposite extreme. And the problem with that in the United States, it doesn't help the situation. You're supposed to, even in times of political conflict, both sides are supposed to cooperate and work together. But it's reached so polarized a state now that the left and right, the Republicans and Democrats can't cooperate in the United States, and it's creating more division, more divisiveness, and more polarization. And it's created more anxiety. If you look at something China has in common with the United States, the levels of drug addiction and what people have called the diseases of despair among the middle class and lower class, alcoholism, drug addiction, suicide. These rates are up all over the United States. And China, we should mention too, does have a drug problem because you hear advertisements on the radio all the time, stay away from drugs. These drugs and alcoholism is a symptom of despair and disappointment and terror and fear.
You have also the gun-related violence on the campus, and Las Vegas, for example.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that just adds to the terror. So I think the conclusion some people are reaching is that that just having this a constitution and a political system set up that should create stability doesn't work if the economic system is out of whack, is out of kilter, and creates massive inequality. Then that's just a recipe for instability.
Next year, 2018, will witness the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx, the spiritual leader of the proletarian movement, whatever happened in the Soviet Union. Now, what he said famously 3 decades ago, if you could remember and share with me the punchline, religion is the opium of the people. And when it comes to the therapy, do you believe faith, beliefs should always be eventually regarded as the most effective therapy? However, this is a very controversial issue in China.
China is basically still a secular society.
Communism belief is always safe, of course, when you talk about this official ideology. But when you talk about the religious beliefs, then in China we have a different political system. The tolerance and the margin for religious faith cannot be a match for the West, right?
Religion could be a way to alleviate anxiety. But in many ways, if you consider China is a more secular society, for example, Confucianism is not really a religion. It's actually a secular way of life. So back to our early point, and I do believe that we should find some middle ground. For example, the recent release of Feng Xiaogang's movie would be a best example. I think this movie actually matches all the needs of different sectors in society, and itself is a huge success, and also a very good solution for this kind of controversy over different social groups.
Well, this guy calls for escapism, right? Cinema is a shelter or sanctuary for those who feel anxious, and they have at least 2 hours of escapism.
Well, it's appropriate because in some ways religion can be escapism as well. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because it turns out that the countries with the most economic insecurity are also the countries that develop the most conservative and deeply ingrained fundamentalist religious traditions. And there's actually a correlation between the economic security. Countries like Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, have very low levels of religiosity, but countries that have high economic inequality and poverty have very high levels of religiosity. And guess what's happening in the United States? A trend towards more fundamentalist religion. So, I mean, China is different because China has always been, as Professor Xu says, a more secular society. But there's still a crisis of faith here. People have to believe in something. And one of the things they have to believe in is that the society as a whole is going to take care of them, or is going to provide them with material benefits into the near future. Once that breaks down, you will see in China increasing turning towards religious practice, because that's all people have when they lose hope in
Not only do you see the rise of populism and radical sentiments in the United States, as you said in the analysis, we see growing spillover of such sentiments into other parts of the world. For example, President Trump calls for relocation of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to please, allegedly, Christian evangelicals in the United States. That will cause yet another intifada and anger from the Arabs as a result. Thank you very much for being with us. This is indeed a very meaningful dialogue about why the middle class, which is growing in size, has developed a kind of a popular anxiety. That is a kind of a popular resentment typical of each and every era since the founding of the PRC. And this is an interesting issue that we're going to discuss further on this platform of dialogue. Until then, goodbye.